Welcome, everyone. I am thrilled to offer today's presentation, today's conversation with Dr. Riz Virk and also Dr. Travis Taylor. We have an event coming up in Nashville, May 16th, 2026, called the Non-Human Intelligence Question, or NHIQ. And just for a moment, I want to talk about the impetus or backstory for this event. A while ago, I was doing Ancient Aliens interviews for a series, a show we were doing on simulation theory. It's something that we've talked about from time to time on the show, but we decided to do a deep dive into it. And it was really interesting to take that perspective on it because the idea is that beginning in the 1980s, we started thinking about this concept really in the modern era of, are we living in a simulation? There was a game called SimCity that came out that changed the video game world. For the first time, the player wasn't just a player in the game. The player was entering essentially from outside the game and manipulating what was going on inside the game from the god-like level. Playing mayor, being a builder, a creator. It was so new, and it triggered some concepts in people, some ideas, including Dr. Nick Bostrom, who wrote a landmark paper in 2003, I think it was, that posited that what if we are in fact living in a post-human, an advanced civilization, a post-human civilization that has created our reality as a simulation for a variety of purposes. And that really struck a chord, and ultimately we landed on the idea that, well, what if the ancient aliens, the Anunnaki, the gods of Sumeria, even the Egyptian gods, are programmers coming from a higher layer of creation, a higher layer of the simulation. What would that do for ancient astronaut theory? Well, of course, it would do a lot. The next day, I was interviewing on ancient rock art, and we were examining art that goes back tens of thousands of years in some cases, a minimum of 8,000 to 10,000 years. These are very primitive images that are chipped into a rock by witnesses who saw what was in their surroundings and then chipped it into the rock. And they would create images of things like plants and trees and stars. But then all over the world are these images of beings seemingly dropping down out of the sky, wearing what appear to be helmets with rays coming off their head. And some of them even look like they're wearing suits of some kind. And these were very primitive. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm recalling the simulation theory interview where we're talking about SimCity and observing how clunky SimCity was back in the 80s. It was like Pac-Man or Pong. But in the intervening 30 years, suddenly video games have gotten hyper realistic. And I'm looking at this rock art thinking, okay, so early man is chipping this into stone, but now today we're using our phones to take pictures and video of what we're witnessing, and maybe they're the same thing that the ancients were witnessing. And now today we have advanced physics that lets us know, hey, wait a minute, these craft that we are taking video of are not operating on physics from this layer of reality. They're coming from a higher layer of reality, which is why they can manipulate the physics of our world. And what if this is more evidence of the simulation? Well, it struck me that what we'd actually be dealing with then is not ancient astronaut theory, which proposes that flesh and blood extraterrestrials came to Earth and were our teachers. It suggests more something along the lines of ancient astronaut theory 2.0, where these beings are the programmers from another layer of the simulation. And as I'm thinking about that, I'm like, okay, I got to get together with the two people who know more about this subject than anybody else that I know, and that is Dr. Riz Virk and Dr. Travis Taylor. And I'm so thrilled that they have said yes to collaborating with me on an event in Nashville, May 16th, 2026, small venue, 125 people, up close and personal, with two of the most illustrious authors and writers and commentators in the field of UAP and simulation theory in one place, combined with me. So I am thrilled today to welcome Dr. Riz Virk, our first guest. As you know, he is an MIT scientist, he's an author, he's an entrepreneur, spent a lot of time in the video game area, has revolutionized our thinking about simulation theory with his books, The Simulation Hypothesis and also the simulation metaverse. So multiverse, pardon me. I'm thrilled to welcome Riz this morning and say, hey, man, thank you for joining me.
Hi, William. It's great to be here with you. And that was a great summary, I think, of where the overlap is with the UAP subject and the simulation hypothesis subject. So I'm glad to be here and looking forward to our event in Nashville.
Yeah, for sure. And the way I kind of view it, Riz, is that it's not just an event, it's not just a conference. It's more, in my view, orientation for the page that we've turned. We've clearly graduated a level. We are no longer in the same world that we were in 2025, right? In terms of our understanding. We've got new video, we've got government people talking about non-human intelligence. They're not quite talking simulation theory yet, but they're on the brink of it. So give us a bit more of your take, excitement about what is happening in our world right now.
Well, so, you mentioned some of the new developments around the UAP subject, but 2025 was also a landmark year for AI development as well. And, often I'll show a video from a new flavor of simulation theory called prompt theory. And you have all these guys in these videos who are basically saying, we're not prompts. And do you really believe all of this behind me is ones and zeros? And yet they're 100% AI generated. And when I first showed it last summer, I think it was probably at Contact in the Desert, people came up to me afterwards and said, are you sure those weren't real actors? And I said, yeah, I told you it was AI generated. And now that's old technology. That's like a year old in terms of how fast AI has developed. And so now Google has released Genie 3, for example, which is a world building engine. And you can actually just tell it, I want to have a virtual world that consists of a desert with a big river and some pyramids and an Arabic city nearby with an island called El Jazeera, all these different things. And it will basically create a virtual world that you can navigate through just like a video game. And so, the fact that we're able to do that, we're starting to approach what I call the simulation point. And this is what got me to go down this rabbit hole in the first place. I first started writing about simulation theory back in 2019, and people thought I was crazy. But what happened was even earlier than that, in 2016, I was playing a virtual reality ping pong game. And what happened was that the responsiveness and physics engine of that game was so realistic that for a moment, my body forgot that I was in virtual reality. And I tried to put the paddle on the table and I tried to lean against the table. And of course, there was no table. I just had this big VR headset on my face. And it wasn't very comfortable. We used to call it a toaster on your face. But the fact that I forgot momentarily shows that we can build immersive virtual worlds. And I began to think, how long would it take us to build something like the holodeck from Star Trek: The Next Generation, or the Matrix, where we would completely forget that we were inside a virtual world. And that led me down this rabbit hole of looking at quantum physics and the observer effect, and then looking at what the different religions were saying about the world not being real. And that's when I came to the conclusion that they were all telling us that we are in some kind of a false reality that is built on information, and there is intelligence that is actually creating this world. And that then I got involved in the overlap, between the simulation subject and the UAP subject, because in the end, the UAP subject is also not just, in my opinion, about extraterrestrials from another solar system. It is about the nature of our reality. And the fact that they render themselves, they just appear out of nowhere sometimes. It's almost as if you're inside a video game, like a World of Warcraft or a Fortnite or some of these that have multiple planets, you don't go from planet A to planet B. You basically de-render yourself in one location, and then you re-render yourself at another XYZ coordinate within that virtual world. And so some of the characteristics of how UAP behave reminds me more of a holographic projection or a rendering within a video game. That doesn't mean they don't become physical craft once they get fully rendered. And just like in a video game, you can walk through walls until the walls are fully rendered, and then you can't walk through the walls anymore. So anyway, that's what got me thinking about the overlap. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And while I was preparing for those Ancient Aliens interviews and getting ready, of course, for our conference as well, I'm finishing my book, The Psychedelic Christ. I have a whole chapter that wades into the simulation theory conversation because of the explicit statements made by Jesus. My book is about Jesus as the Son of Man, and the Son of Man is a term for Jesus. It's a title, but it's also a title of the cosmic access, or the name for the stairway to heaven. And over and over, Jesus makes statements like, I am not from this world. You are from this world. I am not of this world. I am not from this creation, he says specifically in the book of Hebrews. I am from above. You are from below. And you can interpret this as him being from a higher layer of the simulation or reality, parachuting into our world, rendering himself in this world. Then the amazing thing to me is that how beautifully it dovetails, simulation theory does, with what the Tibetans teach in terms of resurrection theory or the rainbow light body, where the body can be dissolved, the human body can be dissolved into its energetic essence, projected to another place in the cosmos, where then the being can phase back into physicality and operate in that new place B that they have then projected themselves to. This is kind of what Jesus did as he parachutes in, dissolves his body into light in the resurrection, then returns to a higher layer, but then projects himself back into our reality. So there are immense spiritual implications of this, as you mentioned, the rendering concept. And I overlap that also with like the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, the belief that we can heal ourselves. And maybe we're not operating on our bodies so much with our mind. Maybe we're operating on the field out here and re-rendering ourselves in a more whole and healthy way.
Yeah, I think that there is definitely overlap. And I think the idea of our physical body being based on information gives us a way to think about how these type of phenomena might happen. Now, you mentioned the Tibetans, and there are many stories in the Tibetan and the yogic traditions in India of masters who would bilocate. They would show up in another location.
Right.
And there's a book called Autobiography of a Yogi by Swami Yogananda, and I actually wrote a book about that,
Yeah.
which HarperCollins India asked me to write it to talk about how the ancient ideas of Maya and karma relate to modern ideas like video games and simulation theory. And in fact, the term for your character inside a video game is called an avatar. And now where does that term come from? Well, it
Right.
comes from the ancient Sanskrit, which means a divine entity that squeezes itself down into a little human body. So it's an incarnation of divinity. And so when each of us is playing a game, we have ourselves, the player that exists outside of the game, and then we have the avatar inside the game. Now, when the guys at Lucasfilm, which was, George Lucas, this company after he did Star Wars and it became a huge success, he started up a video game division, and they had built one of the first multiplayer games called Habitat. And it was a 2D game, and you could only have like 5 people in a room, so it wasn't a massively multiplayer game. But they were looking for a term to describe the little 2D character that you would control as your character. And back then it was with modems and dial-up lines. And they said it felt like I was taking my whole human consciousness and I was squeezing it into the phone lines into this little character on the screen. And so they ended up using the term avatar. But there are so many parallels with the spiritual traditions. I mean, if we think of Genesis and how Genesis describes the creation of the world, if you talk to any scientist, even a few years ago, they would say that's ridiculous, creating the world in 6 days. But if you look at the mechanism that God creates the world with, it's that God speaks. Basically, God commands, and it gets created. And we didn't have a context for that before. And today we do. And even when I was a kid watching Star Trek, The Next Generation, and they had the holodeck, they would program it. And they would say, we're going to have a street in Paris in 1890, with people and with some animals roaming here. And it would just create it. And I thought, that's not programming. They're just talking to it. And now with the way that AI has come up, we find ourselves able to speak and create virtual worlds. So is it possible that the creators of this world actually did create this world simply through commands,
Right.
or divine commands from our perspective, because we're
Yeah.
inside the game. But for the people outside the game, what it means is that they had, control of the code and were able to modify it. And then that starts to explain all kinds of miracles and superpowers, telepathic powers, et cetera, all of those things. You've probably heard of the telepathy tapes,
Sure.
which has become a very popular podcast that talks about these autistic children who had telepathic communications with their usually their parents or with their friends who were also autistic. And Dr. Diane Powell, who's the researcher who first did that research, she called me up several years before the telepathy tapes, and she said, I've got these autistic savant kids, and I think that they're just looking up the information in like a database. They're not actually figuring out these math
Uh,
problems. They're just looking up the answer, and the only kind of explanation she could come up with it was that this was an information-based reality. And so we had a whole symposium on the simulation hypothesis and autistic savants back like
oh,
several years
how
before the
interesting.
telepathy tapes. And so could it be that this is giving us an opportunity to explain how these things might work? In fact, there's one of the autistic girls, Lidu, who has been at certain conferences with her mother, Dahlia, who has a demonstrated blind sight. Her mother came up to me and said, Lidu wants to tell you something. And so she was the autistic girl who has the telepathic capability. I said, oh, what does she want to tell me? She says that when she's doing this telepathy with her friends, it's almost like she's playing a game and she can see what her friends are doing in the other part of the video game. And that, I think, is a great way to think about how some of this phenomenon, might actually work. Now, I'm in academia now, and Travis Taylor, Dr. Travis Taylor, he's been in, with a lot of different scientists, and scientists tended to dismiss this stuff. And part of the reason why was because we didn't have a mechanism for these things. And the simulation hypothesis becomes a way that we can talk about religious ideas, spiritual ideas, esoteric ideas with the scientific community and try to find some common ground.
Yeah, when I called Travis to invite him to do this event, I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm calculating the size of the quantum computer required to simulate the entire universe." And it's like, okay. Yeah, it's such a leap forward. And to me, some people think, "Oh, this," and I used to be this way, thinking about the avatar concept. Oh, that's Silicon Valley mocking and mimicking what we can do spiritually, calling a computer character an avatar. How insulting, right? But it's such a direct parallel. But then when you really get into it and think about it, simulation theory to me is tremendously empowering because it gives us access to almost to the code level, maybe not direct access, but we understand how the universe works. And if we understand that, then that gives us an opportunity to become a better avatar within this realm, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be disempowering. In fact, living in a simulation can be empowering because
Mhm.
if you view yourself as a type of character, just like, if you play Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, which has become popular again because of Stranger Things, at the beginning you kind of choose, your race. Am I going to be an elf, a dwarf, a human? You choose your profession. Am I going to be a wizard, a thief, a barbarian, a warrior, a cleric, all these things. And then you choose a storyline. And is it possible that before we were born, we also chose this particular character because of a certain set of challenges that this character might have to go through? And so
Mhm.
when we all have very difficult challenges throughout life, and we have moments of joy and peace, but we also have, very challenging events and circumstances that come up, whether it's financial, relationships, issues, health issues, which is something that I personally struggled with, that kind of led me to actually write this book. But when these things happen, if we view them as quests within the video game, and you are being given a quest of a certain difficulty level because you are an advanced enough player to be
Right.
able to handle that quest or that suffering. And sometimes people say to me, well, this can't be a video game because if it was, I would choose to be a billionaire and I would choose to be a Hollywood actor,
Right.
kind of like the scene in The Matrix, if you have seen The Matrix, which I know you have, I'm sure, but the
Mhm.
scene where Cypher, who kind of betrays the team tells Agent Smith he wants to go back into the Matrix, and he's like, I want to be someone important like an actor, right? But how many times, how long would it take you to get bored with that game? Because the way video games work is you have to have challenges. And if the second or third time you play the game, it's as easy as it was the first time, well, you're going to get bored. And so I think we can reframe what happens to us as a set of quests or challenges. And then we also can look to the scriptures and the idea of simulation theory and near-death experiences about what happens to us when we die. And one of the things that near-death experiencers talk about is the life review, where they say they have to go back and relive every single event, but from the point of view of the other person. Now, I began to think about this and said, well, as a computer scientist, well, how would that work? The only way that would work is if we were in some kind of a virtual reality and everything is being recorded, and then you could replay it from any XYZ coordinate. You could basically put the virtual camera to the other. And we also hear that you not only have to watch this replay, but you are in the other person's shoes. So, I learned about this from a guy named Daniel Brinkley, and he used to shoot people in Vietnam. And so he had to feel what it was like to be shot by Daniel Brinkley. But then he had to see the ripple effect on that guy's wife and kids that he had just killed. And now if you look at in the spiritual traditions, there's something called the Book of Life in Christianity and Judaism, and then there's the Scroll of Deeds in the Quran. And it turns out they are basically telling us this is a record of all of our deeds, and we have to look and account for those afterwards, which I would say they're basically, those are just metaphors. So oftentimes the angels that are described in the scriptures, in this case, in the Islamic traditions, you have one angel that writes down your good deeds and one that writes down your bad deeds. Now, I don't think that means an angel with a feather pen sitting there writing in, Arabic or Chinese. It means that everything is being recorded and that becomes the basis. When in Revelations it says, and the books will be opened. And then you get to the Book of Life. And if you look at the Jewish traditions, they literally say, well, the Book of Life is like, a list of all the things you did that year. And they even they review it yearly in the Jewish traditions, right? They're supposed to anyway with one of the major holidays. And so what we're really talking about is a function. So the angels, in many cases, not necessarily archangels, but angels in general often are serving functions that are more like AI because they don't always have free will like we do. It's just a metaphor to describe the process of being in the simulation.
Yeah, so I think what we're getting here is a new set of tools. A lot of people, I think what bothers some people is the term simulation itself. It sounds kind of, I don't know, futile. It's like, what's the point in living in a video game sort of a thing? But that's not what we're saying. I think, at least the way I understand it, is that simulation is our contemporary term. Plato spoke in these terms. The Buddha spoke in these terms. The ancient Egyptians said that their creator god, Ptah, manifested out of the blue and spoke all of creation into existence through his word. Okay? And looks very much like a robot, by the way the ancient Egyptians portray Ptah. And he is said to have tweaked our DNA, fashioned the human body, I think, to make it a more conducive vehicle, perhaps to interact with the simulation, the creation, or perhaps even to escape it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, we can view the simulation terminology as the latest and best metaphor to try to describe a world which has been created through whether it's divine commands or prompts, but in which we have agreed to participate and in which we interact with each other. And if we view ourselves as players of the game, then the soul exists outside of the game, and then the body is the character. And in fact, Rumi, who's become, I think, the most popular poet in America, he was a Sufi poet. He said basically that the soul puts on the body just like the body puts on a pair of clothes. Now, that's a metaphor. I don't think he meant literally you go to the closet and you put on a set of clothes. He was trying to describe a process of incarnation, and he had to describe it in words and metaphors that people would understand. And the Buddha said that the world is a dream. In fact, literally, the term Buddha means awake, right? And so if you're awake, that means you were asleep, which means all of this was a dream. And the Tibetans literally use the term dream yoga. And of course, Shakespeare said all the world's is a stage and the men and women are merely players. And it's interesting we use that same term when we're talking about video games. And
What
then
do
a
we
hundred
teach our
years,
kids when they're growing up? The nursery rhyme, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. We're programmed to accept this idea.
yes. And then if you think we are like a dream or a stage play that has some element of free will, where you are able to change things about your life, well, that starts to sound less like a film or a play and more like an interactive multiplayer video game. And so that's why I think the metaphor is a powerful one. And it particularly appeals to the younger generation who, may not be into some of the older ways of describing spirituality, but it's a way
Right.
for them to understand these spiritual concepts in a way that makes sense to them. I mean, that's not even a weird thing from, I think, many younger people's perspective. They spent plenty of time within video games interacting with their friends, so they understand what it means if we are in a virtual world of some kind.
And I think what we're also trying to get at, and one of the kind of the motivations for the NHIQ event we're doing in Nashville in May is to try to think about not just an orientation for a culture or civilization based on these ideas, but to envision it for others. What would a civilization be like that has this as the fundamental operating premise of that civilization?
It's a good question because you can think about, people always ask me, well, if we're in a simulation, what would be the purpose
Hmm.
of being in a simulation? And I always say, well, I'll ask two questions in return. One, why do we play video games? And the
Hmm.
second is, why do we run simulations? And the reason we play video games, you can get different answers from different people, but it almost always boils down to have experiences within the game that you can't have outside of the game. And so
Right.
perhaps, we have chosen to be here to have these difficult emotions that all of us have to face and tests and challenges that we might not have if we're just souls that are love and light outside. And why do we run simulations? Well, we run simulations to see what is likely to happen.
Mm.
And,
Hmm.
we might run a simulation of the weather. We might run simulations of, viruses or
Right.
diseases or
Hmm.
asteroids. And we always try out different things to see what might happen. And so, are we running this civilizational simulation to see if what choices we're going to make? Are we going to blow ourselves up, which I think is a particular concern right now? Are we going to get off the planet? How will we treat other people? Will we follow the golden rule or
Right.
not at an individual level, but then at a civilizational level? What values are we putting out there? And I think that gives us a different way to think about our society as well.
Absolutely. Of course, one of the leading advocates, proponents of simulation theory is Elon Musk. And he's long maintained that we live in a simulation and that we will create simulations on our own very soon. I mean, we already are creating primitive ones, but
Yeah,
he's thinking that the
yeah,
rapid acceleration of computer power is going to create visualization simulations that are indistinguishable from reality and maybe even better than this reality. That is the hope and promise of like the metaverse and things like that. I remember a few years ago, Musk was asked a
yeah,
really profound question, and that is once artificial general intelligence emerges, once we go into the singularity or past or experience the singularity, which some believe we're doing now when the AI that we've created becomes more intelligent than all of us combined, no one knows what's going to happen at that moment. But Musk was asked once AGI has occurred, what would be the first question you would want to ask it? Do you remember what his response
yep,
was?
yep. And his response was, "What's outside the simulation?" Right? And it was really once we get to artificial superintelligence, because
Mm-hmm.
theoretically, that would be the AI that is much more intelligent than we are, and would
Mm-hmm.
be able, to figure out what's going on with the physical world. And Musk also said back in 2016 that 40 years ago we had Pong, which was
Right,
two lines and a dot, and today we
right.
have virtual reality, augmented reality, massively multiplayer video games. And he said, even if it takes us 1,000 years to develop these games that are indistinguishable from reality, we'll eventually get there, because 1,000 years seems like a lot to us, but it's not a lot in cosmic time. And this is actually what got me down the rabbit hole of what I call the simulation point. So I laid out 10 stages of technology development that we would need to basically go through. And when I first started writing about this back in 2018, 2019, we were only about 50% of the way through those stages. And now we're closer to 70% because AI has progressed so rapidly. In fact, I wrote a second edition of the simulation hypothesis last year in the summer of 2025 for that reason, because I was just projecting what might happen with AI. And so the simulation point I define as the theoretical point, a technological singularity where we can create virtual worlds that are indistinguishable from physical reality with AI characters that appear to be AGI, where we can't distinguish them from human characters. And we're rapidly approaching that point. We're also creating quantum computers. And what quantum computers let us do is actually explore many different possibilities at once. And so when I talk about like a simulation might be used to say, hey, what is the most likely outcome, but what is the most favorable outcome? You can actually explore many of these in parallel. That's why a quantum computer can actually, solve problems that would take millions of years on a regular computer. And the question that gets raised, which was raised by Richard Feynman, who basically wrote the paper that was the precursor to quantum computing, is the universe a type of computer already? And it does seem like the universe consists not of physical objects. I mean, anything like this coffee cup, it's 99.9% empty space. And then you go into the molecules and they're 99.9% empty space. And then you go into atoms and they're also, mostly empty space. And when you get to the bottom level, what is it that's there that's substantial? And there was a physicist named John Wheeler in the 20th century, and he came up with this phrase, it from bit. He basically said that when you get right down to it, I mean, we're used to thinking of a particle as like a hard object. Well, that's not really the case. That's not what quantum mechanics is telling us. I mean, electrons aren't like planets that go round and round the nucleus. That's like an old model. And what he said was, at the bottom level of a particle, it's just the answer to a series of yes-no questions. And what are those? Those are bits of information. So he said anything that seems like an it is actually consists of bits of information. So I think, we may be in a universe that is computing and that allows us to explore multiple timelines even. I don't know, you're probably familiar with the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick.
Of course.
And for those who don't know him, he wrote the books behind the movies Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall, and The Man in the High Castle. And he gave a speech in Metz, France in 1977. Now think of the state of computing in 1977, right? The Apple I probably had just come out. And he said, we are living in a computer programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration occurs in our reality. We would have a sense of deja vu, of reliving the same events. Such a clue, such an impression is a clue, he said, that perhaps some variable was changed in time. And so now we start to realize that perhaps there's something going on with different timelines as well. And that gets us down a whole other rabbit hole of the Mandela effect that could be explained in simulation theory. Yeah.
Right. And some of the things you're touching on here that were just information based, were just data. Again, for 15 years writing about AI and transhumanism, those are the types of things that would really trigger me, and almost to the point of being insulted. And now I realize, well, wait a minute, I have a better understanding of what they're talking about here. And what we're really ultimately aiming for is just a revitalization of the human spirit, essentially realizing that there is so much more to our universe perhaps than we ever contemplated. I mean, I just wrote an article about Thomas Jefferson. He wrote the Declaration of Independence just 50 years after the telescope was invented. And they were talking about the plurality of worlds, that look, we can now look out and we see all these stars and planets. They're probably inhabited, right? He was an ancient astronaut theorist in 1776 or 1814 when he's writing to to other of the founding fathers. And it's just, it struck me, it's like, okay, here we are 250 years later. They couldn't even contemplate the technology that we have here, but yet it's the same kind of expansive consciousness. And so much of what we've operated from in the ancient world, you look at the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, we're endowed by our creator. What if we're endowed by our programmer? And all we have to do is just slightly tweak the language and it works still. Our civilization is not going to be going away because of this. We're just going to amplify and perhaps even polish it up, I think. And that is the value of recognizing the importance of simulation theory and overlapping it with what's going on with non-human intelligence.
Yeah, and I think if you look back at any point in history, and I think, this is part of the ancient aliens idea, the people of that time will interpret phenomenon based upon their understanding of the world and their understanding of science and technology. I mean, if you read through any religious scripture, it's full of technological metaphors. Yeah. It'll talk about chariots in the sky, the wheel of Buddha. There's like the gates, the pearly gates. It's all full of technology metaphors. And the book of life is a metaphor in and of itself, because the book is one of the most important technologies. And so as our science and understanding of the physical world increases, we start to take on different metaphors. And so, one of the first science fiction writers was actually Kepler, who, came right after Galileo. So just like you're saying, in that period, just before the Declaration of Independence. And so before that, we didn't know about the plurality of worlds. And so we interpreted these things as angels or as chariots of fire, but perhaps they were actually extraterrestrials. And so that was the next idea that came out, because our understanding of the world had grown to where we knew there were other solar systems. But are we also making a similar, I don't know if it's a mistake or let's say an interpretation, by assuming that NHI is extraterrestrial, because that's about as much as we know of the world. Right. But now we're starting to understand the quantum nature of the world, the informational nature of the world. And now we might realize, okay, these could be avatars coming from outside of the simulation or projecting from somewhere else. So our technology and understanding is helping us to get to a better understanding of what might be going on. And the observer effect doesn't mean we take away, spirituality or soul, because we are the observers, right? We are, in a sense, the ones who create this reality minute to minute by observing it. Doesn't mean we whether we created it originally or not, but by observing it and participating in it, we are changing the reality as we go.
Absolutely. And this is why I'm so excited to host the NHIQ event in Nashville, May 16th, with Dr. Travis Taylor. He's totally into simulation theory and probably knows more about NHI or alien craft than any other person I know on the planet. So it's going to be a wonderful weekend. And Riz, any final words for us before we say goodbye and get ready to welcome everybody in Nashville?
Well, just that I'm really looking forward, to this event in Nashville, and it's my first time in that city, actually. And I'm excited to see these two topics, which I have been kind of playing in these spaces. And they've been like two different parts of my life, like I'm involved with the Galileo Project at Harvard and the Soul Foundation at Stanford. And I've been talking about simulation theory and video games and virtual reality. And I think it's time we bring these two topics together.
Absolutely. It's a merger that's going to be absolutely wonderful. The mandala, the mandorla rather, the portal or gateway that these two intersecting circles will create, literally will be a doorway for people that will enable them to step through and recognize, I think, the greatest perception of the reality of our world that we've ever known. And that is so exciting. So Riz, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you tell everyone how to get in touch with you between now and then, before the Nashville event, or to follow up on some of your work?
Sure. So they can go to my website, which is zenentrepreneur.com, which was based on the title of my very first book, Zen Entrepreneurship. And they can follow me on Instagram at Riz Cambridge, like the city or the university, or on X at Riz Stanford, like the university.
Beautiful. Dr. Riz Virk, thank you so much for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you in Nashville on May 16th.
Can't wait.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you soon.